Hello, good evening, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to Galloway Crab Apples, a year of discovery. Thank you so much all for joining us tonight. The people who have attended previous events will notice that I'm not in my rather untidy house at the moment. I'm actually in the office. We've had a bit of weather in Dumfries and Galloway, those of you local will know, and so it's great to be here with the power on. I hope everyone's been okay and everyone's not survived without too much damage. Part of that damage discussion is obviously apple trees, and it's been obviously quite alarming to see the number of trees that have come down in the last 4 days or so, particularly including apple trees. And some of the particularly people loved apple trees. Oh, we used to get apples there with my grandmother and things. And so a lot of heritage has been lost over the last couple of days, which only endorses efforts to look after apple trees in Dumfries and Galloway, particularly crab apples, which perfectly timed for an event tonight. Really excited about the event tonight. We've got Markus from Royal Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh, who's going to set the scene nationally on apples. Where have apples come from? What do we know about apples on the national stage? And then we'll be zooming in with a bit of a local connection with Jools Cox afterwards. So it's a bit of a conversational thing. We've got lots of time to put questions in. Now I have one slide, only one slide, I promise, that I'm looking to start tonight off with. Just I can't miss the opportunity just to do a little bit of shameless plug about who I am and who we are. So we're working for a new organisation called Dumfries and Galloway Woodlands, and we're looking at trees, habitats, and the people that depend on them. So it's not just the trees, it's the habitats that the trees are in and the people that work with the trees. We are set up as a SCIO. We are a membership organisation. We've now got 150 members, which is very, very exciting. So if you'd like to be a member, it's free to be a member, and you get a lovely warm glow from supporting the work that we're doing. You can also sign up for a newsletter and follow us on the relentless social media. Particular thanks to Woodland Trust Scotland, who've helped us get this far, Scottish Forestry, Dumfries and Galloway Council's Environment Team, Borders Forest Trust, who've been a big support behind the scenes, and the National Tree Heritage Fund, which is allowing us to put events on tonight. And the photo there of the three of the team, that's me, Sam and Phil, and our core work is helping people across Dumfries and Galloway fulfill their native tree ambitions, really. So we'll come out, visit, do a site assessment, give you a steer. We've got access to sources of funding, and it's all about looking after native trees in Dumfries and Galloway. So yes, have a look at our website for more details. But to actually get back to the event tonight, so we've got about half hour or so presentation from Markus. You can put questions in on the right, or comments box on the right, and then I'll pitch some questions and some questions of my own that I haven't prepped Markus about, which is rather exciting after that. And then we'll open to the conversational point with Jools afterwards. Please do pop into the comments if you're anywhere exotic. Please do pop it into the comments. It's always interesting to see how far the event spread. We got into a little bit of trouble last time with the discussion about whether Borg was exotic. So I think we'll just say everywhere is exotic. If you'd like to share where you're from, do feel free to put in where you're from. And then it'll be interesting to see where everyone comes from. So if you're happy, Markus, I can, oh yes, and the event is being recorded, so we'll post it on YouTube in due course. So I think that's the audience white hot with excitement, Markus. If you're happy to take the metaphorical stage, then I hand it over to you on apples on the national scale and why we should be proud of what we've got in Dumfries and Galloway. Thank you.
So I suppose you can see the screen now.
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks very much for the invitation. It's great to give a talk to so many wild apple enthusiasts. And I'm going to talk to you about the conservation of wild apple in Scotland, Malus sylvestris. Well, I suppose everybody in the audience will know what a wild apple looks like. They can be iconic trees, really add an architectural tone to the landscape. Like you're quite familiar with this tree up here, I suppose, because it's from Dumfries and Galloway and has been photographed many times. But they generally really stick out in the landscape, especially in May when they are in full flower. They're very resilient trees. They can survive major catastrophes like being split in half, being bent over, and still manage to thrive, to flower and to fruit. Or they hang on to the edges of steep cliffs in places where you would never anticipate to find a wild apple tree. This photo is from the Western Isles of Scotland, and it's just a shrubby little thing. If you didn't know, you wouldn't know that this is a wild apple tree. It really just hangs on the cliff between rocks and just managed to thrive there. It's amazing. So wild apple is a species that is spread throughout Europe, but it is only in little kind of areas where they grow, and it's not a woodland tree that you would walk your dog through. It's just scattered trees throughout the landscape. So they're quite rare, also widespread, they're quite rare, and red listed in quite a few European countries because it hybridizes with the cultivated apple Malus Domestica. Just to tell you what is Malus Domestica actually. Malus Domestica, our cultivated apple, has its origin in the Tian Shan Mountains from this species here, Malus sylvestris, which is a naturally big fruited species. Most apple species have tiny little fruit, more like the rowan kind of berries, that size. But Malus sylvestris is one where the fruit are naturally quite big and therefore interesting to humans, and that's where the domestication began. So the Tian Shan Mountains are in Central Asia, bordering Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and China. And here, this kind of desert here is the Taklamakan Desert, and here the Tian Shan Mountains. Tian Shan means the sky mountain, which is an appropriate name for this mountain range because the mountains go up to 7,500 meters. So this is a serious mountain range there. And all around the foothills, you can find those ancient Malus sylvestris trees. Here, you can actually walk your dog or ride your horse through an apple grove. And in spring, you get this spectacular kind of landscape where all those white little trees pop up, and you can see that this is a widespread tree there. So that's where the tree originally was cultivated, because it's got those really nice big fruits. People domesticated it, always picking the nicest fruit and then growing them on. And that happened over the last 4,000 to 10,000 years. During that time, those apples were traded along the Silk Route, where they happened to meet the cousin, Malus orientalis, or the Caucasian apple, and the two hybridized. And when the apple was traded further along the Silk Route into Europe, it met our own wild apple, Malus sylvestris, and it hybridized there again. So what we eat in the supermarket has got at least those 3 genomes in it, 3 different species. And interestingly, the latest research shows that there are possibly 2 more apple species involved in our cultivated apple. One is Malus baccata, the Siberian wild apple, and the other one is Malus hupuensis, the Chinese wild apple. So all in all, we are likely to have 5 different apple species in our cultivated apples. And here you can see those East Asian apples are very, very small. They are more reminiscent of a rowan fruit rather than an apple, compared to our own wild apple, which looks quite big fruited against those ones. So they've been hybridizing a lot. Can you still tell them apart? In Clive Stace, who wrote the British Flora and is the British Flora everybody goes to when they identify plants, you can see that Malus sylvestris, the wild apple, generally has glabrous, hairless leaves, which are fairly small, and fruits which are 2 to 3 centimeters large. Whereas the cultivated apple, Here it is called Malus pumila. It now has changed to Malus Domestica. That's the accepted name now. When that edition came out, it was still Malus pumila. So the cultivated apples got hairy leaves on the lower side. They are much larger and obviously much larger fruit as well. So theoretically, it should be fairly easy to tell the two apart. But he also says here, Clive stays, they are morphological, intermediate, and they are frequent. And also that molecular evidence suggests that the two species are distinct. Yeah, that's correct. And now an odd thing to say, that they rarely hybridize, and there are no confirmed hybrid records from the British Isles. This seems unlikely, because if you look into Europe, depending on the area or the country and the scope of the study, you find between 4 and 40% of hybrids, which would suggest that you will find them in Britain as well. Because we've got a long-standing history of domesticated apple in Scotland. There are records from the 12th century, the first orchards, but probably actually even earlier than that. And also, apples were an important commercial crop during the 19th and the 20th century, especially in the Tay and Clyde valleys. Their importance has declined, so there are not as many orchards anymore. But in a fairly recent survey of the National Orchard Inventory from 2018, we still see that there are many intact orchards in Scotland. Like in Dumfries and Galloway, we still got 34 out of those 70 sites surveyed. And in 5, we got even a much larger number. So there are plenty of orchards around, and all of them have apple. So there has been plenty of time since at least the 12th century to hybridize with our own wild native apple. So that's where the conservation concern comes in, that the genetic integrity of the wild apple might be kind of in danger by hybridization with the cultivated apple. But we actually don't know, or until recently we didn't know, because there were no data on this kind of hybridization. So we thought, we need to look at this. We collected 332 samples from the wild, all across Scotland and also the Lake District in northern England, and screened those samples for 14 genetic markers to give us an idea how pure those samples are. Here you can see the results. They are depicted in a kind of bar plot way. One bar represents one individual, and the color gives you an idea of the genetic makeup of this individual. If it's blue, it's Malus sylvestris, and we call it a pure Malus sylvestris sample or tree if at least 90% of the genome is made up of Malus sylvestris. There can be up to 10% of Malus domestica in red, but this is an arbitrary cutoff point. You will never get 100% these days. So we just decided we'll take 10%. Other people take 15% or 5%. It's really kind of an arbitrary cutoff point. You just have to make a decision here. And we said, 10% is the cutoff point for us to call a sample pure. The same thing you can see here for Malus domestica, exactly, in red. If there is 10% of blue in it from Malus sylvestris, we still call it, that's a proper cultivated pure Malus domestica. And the hybrid, a first generation hybrid between the two parental species, is called an F1, first generation hybrid, which would obviously have 50% from one parent and 50% from the other parent. So it would have an equal blue and red color. And then this F1 can either backcross to one parent or the other one. increasing the genomic contribution from that pure parent. So a backcross would have 75% blue and 25% red if it's a backcross to Malus sylvestris. And our results showed that all those 332 samples, 70% turned out to be pure Malus sylvestris. On the left-hand side, you can see the distribution, which is not a random distribution. So there are areas where we've got higher frequency of pure trees than in others. And the one that really stands out are the Southern Highlands here, where we had more than about 80% of pure trees. So the Southern Highlands is the area around Aberfeldy to Loch Lomond, the area in between there. But also other areas like the Lake District and Dumfries and Galloway have very high numbers of pure trees. Other areas like the Central Belt, where there is loads of habitation and orchards and whatever, have lower numbers of pure trees, and it's about 50-50 there. The interesting thing we discovered was when you look at the average genomic makeup of those hybrids, that this is very uniform throughout Scotland. So basically 75% in a hybrid come from Malus sylvestris, our wild apple, and 25% come from the cultivated apple. And that's rather interesting. So 80% of our hybrids turned out to be backcrosses to Malus sylvestris, which is surprising because we have a low frequency of first generation hybrids, only about 3%. To be able to have a backcross, you would need an F1 first that backcrosses back to Malus sylvestris. The frequency is fairly low, so why would you have so many backcrosses to Malus sylvestris? Well, we think there are two reasons. One is it's a reflection of the genetic makeup of cultivated apple and people's habits. And the other one is it's reflection of the historical use and the purity of nursery stock. So doesn't really make sense what I'm saying here now, I suppose. It's not immediately obvious or logic, but I'll explain that in the next few slides, what I mean. If you screen various cultivated apple varieties, you get a nice mixture of genomic makeups. Like here we've got the Cox Orange, which genetically looks like an F1. So we've got 50% from Sylvestris and about 50% from Domestica. A Granny Smith, for example, looks like a backcross to a domesticated apple. So 75% domesticated, 25% pure. And the variety Duchess of Oldenburg looks like a pure Malus sylvestris with more than 90% of the Malus sylvestris genome in it. When you actually see the apples, they're massive. So you know you can't have a pure sylvestris here. That must be a cultivated apple. But it just shows you there's this huge variation of genomic makeups of those varieties. Here's another kind of screen of the plants we've got in the Botanic Garden in Edinburgh. And again, you find a big, nice, colorful picture of different contributions. So there is recent integration from our wild apple into the domesticated apple, and that makes those different varieties so different. So what looks like a hybrid is not necessarily the product of a natural hybridization event, but might be the reflection of people's habits. Well, who hasn't done it? You go out for a nice walk, have a healthy snack, and then off it goes into the wild. It's biodegradable after all. 7 out of our 8 F1s in the sample size we collected along roads abandoned railway lines and footpaths. And if you remember that the Cox orange looks genetically like an F1, and that the Cox orange is the most popular dessert apple in Britain and accounts for more than 40% of the apple production, it's quite likely that those trees are just discarded apple cores. Number 8 in our sample size came from a nice semi-natural woodland in Lanarkshire. And that's one candidate where you think, that might be a kind of a natural hybridization event, until you talk to the farmer here and have a nice chat about the weather and whatever. And then you mention apples and everything. And then he says, there used to be a big orchard down here. So again, this is probably not a natural hybridization event either, but a dispersal from the orchard. And the other reason why we've got so many back crosses is probably the historic use and the purity of nursery stock. Wild apple has been used for cider making, for jam and jelly making, and also as animal fodder. So it is a useful species for a farmer. You can make merry, you can feed yourself, and you can feed your animals as well. So what better tree to plant? So it's likely to have been planted widely. Here we've got an aerial photograph of a typical rural scene in East Lothian, where we have a variety of apple trees, and I'm sure they all planted. Nobody can convince me that this is a natural dispersal event along the road and in the kind of shelter belt here. And we've genotyped those trees. If it's dark blue, it turned out to be a pure Malus sylvestris, a pure wild apple. If it's a lighter blue, it turned out to be a backcross to Malus sylvestris. And there was one tree in this kind of different shade of blue where the software couldn't decide whether this is a pure or a backcross. So it's kind of a borderline tree, but it's likely, I would say, not really pure either. So you've got a nice mixture of different pure and hybrid trees there. And equally, in another rural scene along a country road in East Lothian, these are all planted trees as well. And there were plenty of apple trees, and I've genotyped 4. And you can see that one is a backcross and the other ones are kind of borderline trees as well. And these are situations where you definitely deal with planted material. So where do you get your tree you're going to plant from? 150 years ago, you might have collected seeds yourself and grew on and then planted them out. But I would say maybe 50 to 100 years ago, you are more likely to go to the nursery and ask for a crab apple. And that's why I usually call crab apple wild apple, because crab apple is a very unspecific term, and it just means anything that is small fruited, to distinguish it from the cultivated, big fruited cultivated apple. So if you go to the nursery and say you want a crab apple, meaning whatever, a small fruited tree, you get loads of different crab apples, and they're all something different from our native wild apple. So we wanted to know, if you specifically ask for Malus sylvestris, you want to buy a native Malus sylvestris tree in a nursery, what do you get? So we surveyed some nurseries. I did some retail therapy during work time, went on eBay and various websites, nursery websites, and bought wild apple trees that were specifically labeled as Malus sylvestris. So we had 13 nurseries altogether, and on average had about 10 wild Malus sylvestris trees from that nursery, ordered it, grew it on, took leaf samples, and then genetically assayed them. You can see there are 4 nurseries with a star, and that star means that these are forest reproductive material registered nurseries, which are nurseries that adhere to a set of industry standards regarding genetic quality and provenance. So they are tighter regulated, and usually nurseries that supply trees and plants to conservation agencies, for example. All the other nurseries are just kind of bog standard nurseries. And we also noted where they actually get their stock from. So all the FRM registered nurseries had wild UK collected stock, whereas most of the other ones weren't quite sure whether it was UK or not. Probably UK, but it could also be Holland. So there was no clear indication where those trees came from. Right, so we surveyed those for the same genetic markers as in our wild apple paper I've just told you about. And we get a nice colorful picture here. Here the BAC, HU, OR, and SI are our reference trees for Malus baccata, Hupuensis, Orientalis, and Sylvestris. So these are the Asian trees which have some contribution to the cultivated apple. Here are reference trees for Malus domestica, and here are reference trees for Malus sylvestris, the wild apple, which turned out to be pure in our survey. And N1 till N13 are our 13 nurseries where we surveyed their stock. And you can see there's not a random distribution of the stock. There are some nurseries which do well and others which don't do that well. And interestingly, if you kind of have the summary of the survey, less than 50% of the trees we surveyed that were sold as Malus sylvestris turned out to be pure Malus sylvestris. 25% turned out to be pure Malus domestica. About 10% the hybrids between the two. And the rest were either the Malus orientalis group, the baccata, Hupuensis, Sylvestris group, or some kind of exotic hybrid between those species. So all in all, this didn't really give you confidence in going to the nursery, asking for Malus sylvestris, and you get Malus sylvestris. Actually, less than 50% of the time you would get Malus sylvestris, depending on the nursery where you buy it. Because the FRM, Forest Reproductive Material Registered Nurseries, the one with the star, did really well. So you can see that most of their stock was actually pure Malus sylvestris. We had some kind of exceptions, but generally this was a really good place to buy pure Malus sylvestris. And these are the ones that came from wild UK collections. There's another nursery, N13, which also said that they got their stock from wild UK collected trees, but gave a much kind of poorer picture of what they actually sold. Most of those were hybrids. So why is that? And here we've got our rural scene again, and that's actually a place I know that a nursery goes and collects their seeds to sell on as Malus sylvestris. And as you can see, we've got some pure Malus sylvestris trees there, but we also got a lot of back crosses and other hybrids there. So even if you go to a pure tree and collect the seeds from there, that doesn't necessarily mean you get actually pure seeds, we did a paternity analysis, which means we collected seeds from various trees and genotyped those seeds again for the same markers. So we could say whether the tree, that seed is actually a pure seed or a hybrid seed, because it might have been pollinated by one of the surrounding trees that are of hybrid origin. And if that happens, then the seed must have some hybridity in it as well. So for example, this tree here, we collected 15 seeds, genotyped them, and 60% of those seeds turned out to be pure and 40% hybrid. In another tree, we had a similar situation, 60 to 40, basically. And if you genotype all the trees around there, you can actually then find out which tree pollinated your target tree, here or here. So 4 seeds came from the neighboring tree. 3 seeds came from the neighboring tree here. 5 seeds from the neighboring tree there, which is quite surprising, because I would have thought that this tree is only 5 meters away from the target tree, that most of the hybridization, or let's say the pollination, would have come from this tree. But yeah, no, it wasn't like that. And we actually got 1 seed from further away, and 1 seed was pollinated by the pure tree here. So you have a nice mixture of different seed origins, which probably will give you a picture like this. And if you go there the next year, you might have a different mixture there, because yeah, it very much depends on the wind direction, the pollinators that are around, and you can't really be sure if you go to a pure tree to get pure seeds if there are loads of other hybrid trees around those trees. But my question is also, how easy is it actually to say that this is a pure tree and this is a hybrid tree? I mean, do the people who work at the nursery actually know the difference, or can they tell the difference? Can we tell the difference? So we tested ourselves. Generally, as I've shown you in the new flora of the British Isles, the characters are quite easy, but there are loads of morphological different intermediates, so it's not always that easy to decide on the spot there, is this really pure or is it hybrid? So a pure wild apple tree, you would expect it to have glabrous, hairless leaf underside, whereas in a hybrid, you would expect some hairiness. The fruit size in a pure tree would be 2 to 3.5 centimeters, whereas in the hybrid, it would be something like 3.5 to 6 centimeters. So there is some overlap there. And when we went into the field for our first study, we recorded what we thought was either a pure tree, a possibly hybrid tree, or a domesticated tree. And we also recorded our confidence. So sometimes you say, yeah, that's definitely a pure tree. And on another occasion, you would say, probably a pure tree, but yeah, there are some characters which are slightly dodgy, probably a hybrid. And the interesting thing was that only 68% of the time our identification was correct. So 32% we actually got it wrong. And the astounding thing is here that 25% of our identifications, we were confident that this is the right identification, and it turned out not to be. So a pure tree was either hybrid, or hybrid, what we thought was a hybrid, turned out to be a pure tree. So it is not easy to differentiate between pure and hybrid in the field. And I actually think it's impossible to say with confidence that this is pure, this is a hybrid tree, because yeah, the interpretation of morphological characters is vast, and I've seen pure trees with apple size of nearly 4 centimeters, and that's something, yeah, you wouldn't consider to be a pure tree, but genetics tell you that it's pure, so it's likely to be a pure tree. So yes, it's not easy to differentiate between those in the field based on morphological characters alone, and that's why a nursery which goes out into the field will have difficulties as well finding the right pure trees. And if they are pure, then they might be pollinated by a domesticated tree and then get hybrid seeds as well. So that's all from me. Thank you.
Markus, thank you. Thank you so much for that. What I was trying to do was I was trying to write down bullet points of things that I'd learned, and then what I kept doing was putting a line through them after you then identified why that couldn't be used as a feature to identify. So, I mean, on a very basic level, it would be really nice if the size of the apple related to the genome split that's happening there. But then when you see such a small element of Malus sylvestris providing such what looks like a cultivated apple, it makes you realize that the challenge we have. And then you shouldn't call them crab apples, we call them wild apples, but 25% of what you buy are not actually wild apples. I mean, it brings a number of challenges to it. And yes, you start wondering how we can try and progress this topic in Dumfries and Galloway. But absolutely fascinating, Markus. And I would love to, if anyone's got any questions for Markus, do please pop them in the chat and we'll come to them in a second. But I'd love to abuse my position just by asking, first of all, I'd love to know, Markus, how you ended up in the field that you're in. Did you express an interest in apples 10 years ago and now people from all across Europe come to you with their apple-related questions? Or how did you see the need for this sort of research?
Actually, that was instigated by somebody else, by Rick Worrell from Aberfeldy, who had an interest in apple trees, and he's a forester, and he doesn't really. So he's outside a lot, and he said that even foresters often don't know that Malus sylvestris, the wild apple tree, is a native tree in Britain. Many people think it's not a native tree. And he was astounded that we don't have any information at all about apple trees in Britain. So he thought, we need to do something about it, and contacted me and said, you want to do something? And I said, yeah, why not? And that's how it all started.
And there's no turning back now. Can you explain why do you see it as important to conserve the pure native apple? Do you see as the sort of contemporary uses or anything beyond the sheer need to preserve it? Or what drives it?
Well, in a way, because our wild apple has contributed substantially to the cultivated apple. So the estimates are about 30% of many of the cultivars are actually from our wild apple, in the domesticated apple. It's nice, so it would be great to keep the wild apple genome as it is, because then you can use it for breeding. And wild species always have desirable characters you would like to see in a domesticated variety, for example. They are more disease resistant, more blight resistant, for example. So, and in terms of climate change and everything warming up, you might want, different varieties that are better in coping with certain climates. And it's good to have the pure stock, basically, to be able to do that.
Yeah, and with the rate of change, it's good to have a handle on it, at least for unexpected benefits that happen, aside from the sheer simplicity of wanting to preserve the purity of it. A couple of questions here before we cut to the next part of the evening, but we have some trees that Rick has verified as wild, but they have reddish fruit rather than yellow-green. Have you ever seen this, Markus, or does this just feed in that colour also has no bearing?
Well, I'd like to know how he verified it. Is it something he sent me and I tested it, or was it based on glabrous leaves, small fruit. And to be honest, I've seen some very small apples with a reddish tinge as well. And I thought, this is pure. This is pure. It looks very pure, kind of complete glabrous leaves, and everything was right. But when you test it, it just turned out not to be pure. It was a backcross, for example. So I think the problem we have these days, we actually don't know what the pure Malus sylvestris genome looks like, because we can't go back 5,000 years and test the tree from that time. Yeah. We just can test what we've got. And that has been hybridizing a long time, at least 1,000 years. So it's as pure as it gets. What I call pure is as pure as it gets. And we had somebody in Holland. They've got an even better genetic assay, and I've sent them 5 samples, what turned out to be really pure trees with my markers. And actually, we weren't far off, but definitely there was only one tree which he thought has very little introgression. All the other ones had larger amounts of introgression, which would push it over the 10% limit, and then you wouldn't call it pure again. But yeah, the more markers you have, the more differentiated your results will be. But I think it's actually not that important whether it's 10% or 15% or so. It's as pure as it gets these days.
Just to clarify, follow up to the question Matilda said, actually, it's not actually testing the trees; it's based on seeing them in the field. The color. So that possibly, so in sort of simplicity, is you would be skeptical about the redness. Was the sort of angle?
Theoretically, yes, but yeah, practically it might turn out to be pure. Yes, I've been surprised many times.
Markus, this is brilliant. Thanks so much. I've got a question here that I'm really glad. It's a question from Anna Lawrence. I'm so glad Anna's asked it. I'm aware I came up to see you a couple of months ago, Markus, and I'm aware this question could get very detailed very quickly. But just as a headline point, you've been using these genomic markers to identify. What are your reference trees, and how are you confident in your markers? Is there something you can say, just very sort of headline point about that?
So you've got 14 genetic markers, and most of them are shared between the 2 species, but there are so-called allele differences, frequency differences. So one allele, one genetic marker might be more frequent in the other parental species than in Malus Domestica, for example. So you've got frequency differences, and if you've got 14 markers and you've got a good program, a good statistical program, and I'm not going to go into details here, but this program, if you feed all your data in, then uses each genomic makeup or each allele frequency in a sample and puts that into categories and groups those to, it's this group, there's another group that looks different, and there's another group that looks different here. And in the end, you get those nice colors where you can see that this group has only one color and the other group has a different color. And then you look at your samples and you know, okay, that's the Malus sylvestris group and that's the Malus Domestica group. And then you just say, okay, these are my pure trees based on your genetic data. And if there is a mixture, then they can't be pure.
Okay, cool. So it gives you some confidence that what you're choosing has
exactly.
some back up to it. I think, yeah.
You need loads of samples, and we've got plenty of samples. We've got I've tested more than 1,000 now. So you've got a good reference library basically, and that gives you then the confidence that if something is really blue, that this is as blue as it gets basically.
Brilliant. We're starring the questions here, so we will answer all the questions. So I'm conscious we should come to the other presentation. Just ask one very quickly, a question here from Maz about when you're planning wild apple walks to enjoy the blossom, it can be really hard to get a good date because even in one place, apples bloom on different days. Do you have anything you've picked up on about what makes a tree decide when to bloom, or factors there, or you could say many variables, you could say, but I don't know.
Yes, but I think probably temperature is a big factor, because in early May you get nice blooming trees here in the central belt, and there's nothing out in Aberfeldy or in the Southern Highlands because it's still too cold there. So there can be 2 to 3 weeks difference between those climate regimes.
Cool. Okay, so you think temperature is probably a key, absolute key factor. Kirsty's asked a question about who to speak to when you see an unusual apple tree. We'll probably come to that in our second presentation. But great question from Richard here about many years ago, my dad had a very scruffy orchard in the corner of his field. Out of maybe a dozen trees, there were perhaps 3 that always referred to as cider apple trees, gnarled trunks, smaller and relatively bitter fruit. Are these likely to have been true wild apples? So interesting there to see a selection of trees with a sort of defined corner in it. But I suppose that's probably, there's a number of asterisks you'd have to in answering that question, probably, Markus.
I think it's unlikely. They'll have some domesticated genome in them as well.
Cool. Final questions come in, which I do want to ask. What is the lifespan of pure Malus sylvestris compared to hybrids or Malus Domestica? Is there anything you picked up on, Markus, about difference between?
I mean, apples are generally a short-lived species. So if you find something that's 80, 100 years old, then this is old for an apple tree. Yeah. And I don't think there's any difference between the hybrid and the pure, because both parental species are short-lived. So the hybrid is likely to be short-lived as well, or a similar kind of time span.
Cool, brilliant. There are a couple more questions there. I will come to the end, but I just want to, again, we've got a section here with Jools. I'd love to call Jools in, and we've got a couple of slides, because what Markus has done brilliantly there, with a couple of asterisks of things to be clarified and considerations to take, is try to set the national picture of how you test a wild apple, not crab apple, wild apple tree. And I suppose I'd love, Jools, to bring it to the local context. So I don't know if we could draw in the slide now, but the really in the last year, Jools, we've tested 110, I think we had across the region. And was it easy finding the samples, or did lots of people offering samples, or how did it go?
We did 110 this year. Last year, 2024, and we did 113 in 2022. We haven't had any trouble with putting it out there to citizen scientists and people sending in leaves. We were inundated with leaves because people have got the message now. We've been putting it out there. We've been doing it for quite a few years now, and people are getting their eye in. And we've said, to pick trees which are a good distance, at least 500 meters away from a domestic apple or a crab apple that looks like it could have been ornamental, i.e. very red apples. And yes, we've had plenty. We've had lots and lots. We had more than almost we could cope with, which shows there are plenty out there. And everybody I speak to now has seen others and have told us about others, and I've seen lots. And I just think it's fantastic that this area seems to be quite a little hotspot.
How did wild apples cross your desk initially, Jools? Was this something that you'd seen in the landscape and wanted to know more about, or was it from a scientific angle? How did it get into your radar?
It's reading the work of Rick Worrell when he first started doing it, and the Darwin Tree of Life project, where they're sequencing the genomes of all the species, and so thinking that we've got them here, and let's see what ours are like.
And so here, a great slide there of the samples being collected. So we had to put the anti-desiccating agent in the bag and then get 2 leaves from each tree. Did you find the trees were particularly inaccessible they do love a craggy, inaccessible spot, don't they?
They do, yes, they do. And a lot of the times one time particularly, I don't know if Mark Zagadlo is listening, but we were up at Glen Midge, and it was torrential rain, and there were trees along the track along the bottom, but then he said, there's but a bigger one up there, and we scrambled through. We climbed hand over fist through the bracken, which was over our heads, to get to the trees that were at the top. But it was good because the trees that were along the track, which were much lower down, were nearer the village, and they turned out to be to have some hybridization, whereas the trees at the top were still pure, and they were pure.
That just makes
yes, it's worth the scrabbling. And the other place are trees like the ones at Almaness Point, which, you know, right on the coast and battered by the wind, and they're actually molded into the cliffside. And but that tree, some of those trees up there have got enormous trunks, and I'm sure that they must be older than 100 years old. Definitely. It would be really nice to find out.
If there's one question,
wouldn't it be wonderful? Wouldn't it be wonderful for us to be like the Tian Shan Mountains here? If we all start planting them and plant them out on the Galloway hills, and we could ride and cycle and walk through crabapple trees all through May. Wouldn't that be fantastic? We can do it.
And I know, Jools, there's a balance between the rest of your life and wild apples, and we want to keep that balance at some point. But the biggest question I'm getting asked, obviously, is has anyone got any wee trees or any saplings that I can plant that are certified pure or have been certified as pure? And is this something you've exploring a couple of locations? You had some with Peter Livingston, didn't you, and some more locally?
Yes. Well, we've got quite a few people. Some people are doing it anyway. They know, you know, some. On the first survey we did, we gave out the OS references, so people have picked apples from there and have grown them on. Peter Livingston up in Perthshire, he's growing them in his native tree nursery. There's another wee tree nursery that started in Ayrshire, they're growing them on. But we've got lots of individuals in Dumfries and Galloway. We've got Gareth, we've got Naomi, we've got Maggie, we've got lots of people who are growing them. And today I handed over to you. You've got a sample here. Some that I've grown, which are going out to the new community orchard, not community out of Corsic.
Brilliant. So I think the simplest answer to the question is, if someone watching this today is interested or is interested in one or two, or just making contact with local providers, probably best to if you give me a message initially to my email address, mcnab.laurie@dgwoodlands.org, I'll try and have a word with Jools and we'll get something established. There is a discussion obviously underway with Dumfries and Galloway Woodlands as a new organisation. How can we help actually solidify this and try and meet this demand? Because the great work that Jools has done over the years has got the interest there, and now we've got the support of Markus to give us confidence in what we're doing. And so the next step is people saying, how do I know that the trees I'm planting are certified, and how can they find the process of it? So in terms of looking through the year, Jools, was the talk of a crab apple day? Well,
we've sort of designated May the 15th as crab apple day. Like Markus says, it depends on warmth, but anytime from the 10th to the 15th, is usually good. It's great to see the crab apples before the hawthorn comes out. So as soon as if you see apples starting to blossom, you'll guarantee that the crab apples will be blossoming. So get out into the countryside in around about 10th to 15th and spot them all. They're a lot pinker than the hawthorn, obviously. So you notice this pink flush. You know, go down to Carrick, go across the fields there, go down to Redhame, go down up on Almaness Point, all places where you can walk and spot them. They're just beautiful, and they stand out so well when they're covered in blossom, like I say, before the hawthorn.
Brilliant. So let's say May the 15th, Dumfries and Galloway initiating the May the 15th crab apple day there. I think that's a great thing to do. So people can grow their own on. I think we've got some advice and tips, haven't we, on the DG Woodlands website for how to grow them on. We've also got some recipes. They take a bit of work, don't they, Jools, if I'm right, in a recipe?
Not really, no. You just boil them up, put them through muslin, you've got your juice, and then you can make whatever you want. And then you can squash the pulp through and sieve it and make crab apple cheese. You can make savoury dishes, you can make sweet dishes, you can... Yeah, it's very, very versatile.
Okay, cool. So it's
you can use the wood for carving. You can use every part of the apple tree.
Brilliant. I've got so just jumping to the questions in the chat there. There's if you find an unusual apple tree, is this someone you can contact to see what the apple makeup is? So I'm very conscious that the Royal Botanic Gardens of Edinburgh has a broader remit than the wild apples of Galloway, which has been dominating our focus a little bit in the last couple of years. So there will come a time when the Botanic Gardens do want to look at other species in other areas of Scotland. So we have already got a few people who have expressed an interest, saying, "Oh, I missed last year's testing. I wasn't able to get my sample in. Could we be doing it again?" We don't have any immediate plans to do another test. We'll look at another batch, looking to obviously do some fundraising to cover the costs of it and things. But if you do keep an eye on our channels and keep in touch with us, if you have a tree that has escaped testing so far and you would like it, because I'm sure Markus would be delighted to do another batch in due course. In due course, we'll keep it in the loop there. So picking on other questions here. Oh, Jill. So Jill from Ayrshire. I see the furthest north is almost at Sanker. I haven't found any likely candidates in East Ayrshire, but I think I'll look harder. And then any other questions? How old are the trees? Are there any natural seedlings? I think we sort of covered that. And yes, I think I'd love to end with maybe if I could draw Markus back in. Markus, I'm very interested in this the potential for Dumfries and Galloway to be a bit. I think the word you used in the press release was hotspot, really, and I think that's quite a good phrase to end with, because I think there's lots of complexity, there's lots of nuance to this sector. It's not a case of we're the global leaders in pure wild apples or anything like that, but sort of hot spot. Is that a phrase you've been using as the interest for Dumfries and Galloway?
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not a leaderboard, it's not a competition, but there is something special in Dumfries and Galloway, presumably due to, and you talked about land use and particularly orchards and population centres.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Best way of putting it. Cool. Superb. I'm just looking here. Also, go for it.
The Gene Conservation Unit. I think Maz would like to have a little word about that, if that's possible. Because the Gene Conservation Unit is helping farmers, well, not helping farmers, or letting farmers help the whole project by, if they've got a lot of crabapple trees on their farm or on their land, there's a way of them being helped by the Gene Conservation Unit. But perhaps if people are interested in that, they could get back to us.
Is that something you know about, Markus, or should we leave that as people to do their own research?
Yeah, probably like that.
Yeah. Cool. And there's a question here: would you be against us planting commercial crabapple trees because they might hybridize? And this is a really interesting question, because when we went back to everybody who'd submitted their samples, sometimes we were going back saying the pure tree which you have loved as a family for generations is not actually, it's actually a hybrid or even majority Malus Domestica. But I think I was trying to soften it at that point to say, love your tree no less, because it is still an apple tree. It's still a special part of the connection and biodiversity value. And I suppose would you endorse that, Markus and Jools? It's not a case of loving trees less or more. It's just understanding them a bit better.
Definitely, I would not recommend chopping anything down because it's not pure. What I would recommend, if you want to, and I wouldn't say don't plant any cultivated apple more or any other apple species. I would say don't plant it where the wild apples grow. So if you have it in your garden, I don't see a problem there. But if you go out into the nature and then do it there, then that might be more questionable. But generally, I haven't published anything on that, but it's kind of on the go, is that the pollination distances are generally not that far. So I would say 90% of the pollination comes from nearby trees, i.e. 10, 20, 30, 50 meters away. So if you have a tree, a hybrid tree or a cultivated tree, which is a kilometer away, you're unlikely to be pollinated by this tree if there are other trees surrounding the tree.
Cool. Brilliant. And the update from Maz there is Gene Conservation Unit. If you have more than 50 apples on your land, you can apply as part of the Gene Conservation Unit. So it's quite interesting to know there's a threshold there. Brilliant. I think we should, that's a lot of wild apple related information on a Tuesday evening. So we should probably start to wrap things up. Are you happy, Jools? Is there anything you'd like to add from your point of view?
No, just keep planting apples. Wild apples.
Keep planting wild apples. Brilliant. So this event's been recorded, and so it'll be posted on our YouTube channel in the near future. Absolutely massive thanks to Markus, who I know is chatted up a lot to speak at different events and very kindly joined us tonight. Massive thanks as well to Jools, who's been a complete local superstar in getting the 110 samples together, getting them batched and sent off last year. And I think it's been a perfect example of sort of citizen science working locally, supported by a national organisation. So I'm very, very grateful. From Dumfries and Galloway Woodlands point of view, thank you so much to everyone who's joined us tonight. Keep an eye on our social media channels for future events. I can give you a hot off the press announcement. 25th of February, it's finally happened. Dumfries and Galloway Woodlands is doing an event in partnership with the Dumfries Archival Mapping Project, DAMP. So Dumfries and Galloway Woodlands and DAMP, we're talking about old woodlands. How old are they and why are they there? Which the title is possibly needs to be finessed just slightly, but it should be quite good fun. So it's online event, 25th of February, but keep an eye on our channels for more information on that. Thank you so much again to Markus and Jools. Thank you to everyone just joining tonight. And I think here ends the event. Thank you all so much.